A key theme of the post-war era was the mass migration of people. We've talked about it before on this channel, from the ethnic deportations in the Soviet Union to the forced migrations of ethnic Germans across much of Europe. But it is important to realize that mass movements of people happened around the world and had serious impacts and consequences on the areas where it happened. I'm your host David, and this week we are going to talk about a mass migration that is often overlooked: the movement of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese from north to south as part of Operation Passage to Freedom. This is the Cold War. Expanding your knowledge is a lifelong process, and the sponsor of this video, Magellan TV, is a perfect place to continue your journey. Magellan TV's historical documentaries are a great complement for Cold War channel videos, and if you're interested in learning more about how the American war in Vietnam was concluded, then you need to watch Vietnam: Secret Negotiations That Ended the War. This new documentary looks at the secret negotiations held between Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, which resulted in the Paris Peace Accords. You can join us and watch this documentary by using our link in the description. Don't forget to check out other documentaries in Magellan TV's American Stories section to learn more about President Nixon. And the good news is Magellan TV has much more than that. There are more than 3,000 documentaries waiting for you, and hundreds of them are on the history of various eras. We particularly love the Human Spirit documentaries on Magellan TV, as they are a perfect way to explore the idea of what it means to be human, and all in stunning 4K from the comfort of your own home. New documentaries are added weekly and available on most devices, including phones and PCs. Magellan TV has a kind and exclusive offer for our viewers. Click the link in the description to get a 1-month free trial and watch hundreds of history documentaries anytime, anywhere. The 1954 Geneva Conference was held from April 26th to July 20th of that year in an attempt to settle issues resulting from two of the largest post-war conflicts in Asia. The first was the Korean War, and the other was the First Indochina War, that had ended with France's and French Indochina's decisive defeat by the Viet Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Accords, signed by representatives of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, France, the People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, dismantled French Indochina into 4 states. It created the Kingdom of Cambodia and the Kingdom of Laos, while Vietnam was divided in 2 at the 17th parallel, a move that echoed Korea's division a decade earlier. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, came under the control of communist forces led by Ho Chi Minh, while the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, was to be governed by the Roman Catholic Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, himself backed by the West. The division was not intended to be permanent, however, as elections had been scheduled for 1956 in order to reunify Vietnam under a single national government. The Geneva Agreement also granted a 300-day grace period set to end on May 18, 1955. During the 300 days, people would be free to cross the border between the two states. The situation resulted in the mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of people moving from North Vietnam to the south, while a smaller number of immigrants traveled in the opposite direction. French leadership was primarily concerned with the transfer of French Army and French Union troops, and as a result, little thought was given to the movement of civilians. General Paul Ehrlich's early estimates of the number of civilians who would look to relocate were quite low. The French Commissioner General expected about 30,000 people, while the French Prime Minister, Pierre Mendès, expected a slightly larger wave, announcing plans to provide aid for around 50,000 people. It was quickly realized that these predictions were off by a large margin. Thousands of people, many of whom had been heavily linked to the French colonial regime, the result of religious conversion or from working with the colonial administration, felt they could no longer live in the war-torn North, which was now controlled by the Viet Minh. Facing not only difficult conditions, but also persecution, they made the decision to move to Hanoi and Haiphong, still in French hands, looking to secure passage aboard planes or ships heading to the south. By the early days of August, more than 100,000 refugees had gathered in the camps that sprawled across the two cities. The authorities were totally unprepared for such a large number of people, so it was no surprise that the situation in the camps quickly devolved into chaos. Immigrants fought over limited resources, while the camps themselves threatened to become breeding grounds for various diseases, as proper sanitation and clean water were virtually non-existent. Facing a humanitarian crisis, and with the French Navy and Air Force unable to handle the sheer number of people, the French government turned to the United States to request assistance. The US government, for their part, realized the massive public relations and propaganda boon that such an operation could bring, and were quick to mobilize an evacuation task force. Rear Admiral Lorenzo Sabin was placed in command of Task Force 90, and he and his staff soon drafted Operation Order 2-54, an outline of what later would become Operation Passage to Freedom. The rather lengthy document provided guidelines for the conduct and support of the evacuation effort, which included soldiers of the French Union, their equipment, and of course, the civilians migrating to South Vietnam. The ships involved were free to sail independently from one another, yet because the American command feared intervention from the People's Republic of China, either by aerial attack or by submarine, there were also plans for a convoy system. This plan allowed for air and naval surface forces, which would escort the transfer ships to the safety of the designated disembarkation point, which was naturally Saigon, the capital of the new Republic of Vietnam. Although neither the PRC nor the Viet Minh harassed the American task force, this didn't mean that the operation was easy. From the outset, it was a logistical nightmare, as the ships needed to be stocked with food, water, clothing, fuel, medical supplies, and even war material, just in case they were attacked. Medical care was especially important, as many of the refugees were suffering from injuries and sickness, not to mention the ever-present threat of diseases such as typhus and malaria. Another factor adding to the difficulty of the evacuation was the language barrier between the US personnel and the Vietnamese immigrants, as neither spoke each other's language. This was mitigated somewhat, as French served as a decent link between the two groups. Quite astonishingly, in some cases Latin was used as a bridge language, as it was spoken by the ship's chaplains and migrating Catholic priests. In fact, the priests proved to be invaluable, as they were capable of maintaining order among the refugees. With the completion of necessary preparations for the enormous task ahead of them, Passage to Freedom was given the go-ahead, and on the 11th of August 1954, the first American ship, USS Menard, originally heading for Hong Kong, arrived in Turon Bay, present-day Da Nang Bay. 5 days later, 1,924 refugees boarded the Menard that then headed towards Saigon. Other American ships, including USS Estes, USS Comstock, and USS Montague, attack transports and landing ship docks, were en route and would soon take part in the operation. Despite facing difficulties and setbacks, including a typhoon, the US Navy had, within 2 weeks, managed to transport some 47,000 Northerners to the south. The rate of transportation was in fact so high that the government of South Vietnam had to impose a limit of 2,500 incoming passengers per day into the ports of Saigon and Vung Tau, which lasted until September 25th. As time passed, the number of migrants dropped, the result of various factors, including the closing of the port of Hanoi after the Viet Minh were given full control of the city on October 10th. Also factoring into the decline was the Viet Minh's propaganda efforts, as well as another typhoon that struck the area in December. But the end of the operation, after 109 sea trips, the US Navy had transferred 310,000 people, while the French Air Force and Navy carried a further 500,000. Among them were 190,000 French and Vietnamese soldiers, as well as returning prisoners, 43,000 military dependents, 15,000 to 25,000 Nung tribesmen, 40,000 French citizens, and 45,000 Chinese citizens. This population movement, however, wasn't just happening in one direction. At the same time, there was a smaller, yet still significant movement of people from the south of the country to the north, with estimates ranging between 14,000 and 45,000 civilians migrating, as well as around 100,000 Viet Minh fighters, though it should be noted that quite a number more of them stayed behind and prepared for future confrontations. The evacuation effort, similar to the Republikflucht in Germany, was the perfect opportunity for the United States to showcase the superiority of the West, and how people preferred capitalist regimes to communist ones. To do this was theoretically simple: get as many people from the north to the south as possible. But, not wanting to leave things to chance, efforts were made to convince people to move by means of a systematic propaganda campaign led by the CIA. Heading up this part of the operation was Colonel Edward Lansdale, recently arrived in Saigon from the Philippines after successfully helping put down the Hukbalahap rebellion there. He was officially the Assistant U.S. Air Attaché in Saigon, but in reality, he led a team of psychological warfare experts who employed a number of strategies and tricks to try and swell the number of evacuees. South Vietnamese soldiers were ordered to dress in civilian clothing and spread rumors that the Viet Minh had allowed 2 Chinese divisions to enter Vietnamese territory and that these troops were now roaming free, raping and pillaging as they pleased. Fake Viet Minh leaflets were printed that were so well crafted even northern officials believed they were genuine. The leaflets gave instructions to the people on proper behavior once the communists took over and told them to make a catalog of their possessions so that the communists could easily confiscate whatever they wanted. Lansdale and his team also employed various soothsayers who predicted impending doom and disaster in the north, but prosperity in the south. This impending doom was reinforced by the circulation of fake rumors among the northern populace by CIA agents. According to these rumors, the United States was planning a major offensive to liberate the north as soon as the 300-day grace period was over and all who opposed the communist regime had moved below the 17th parallel. Furthermore, it was said that the US would deploy its nuclear arsenal during the upcoming war, so anyone who wanted to avoid the nuclear holocaust had to move south. Accompanying this rumor was another fake pamphlet showing a map of Hanoi superimposed with 3 mushroom clouds. A propaganda campaign was also launched specifically targeting Vietnamese Catholics, who already constituted the majority of the immigrants moving south, the group Diem most wanted to attract. The campaign appealed to their religious beliefs and played against their fears that the new communist regime would spell the end to freedom of worship. Thousands of leaflets with slogans, "Christ has gone to the south," and "The Virgin Mary has departed from the north," were printed and distributed. Other flyers depicted the Viet Minh closing a cathedral and forcing the people to pray under a picture of Ho Chi Minh. In the churches, Catholic priests preached that the communists would not allow the worship of Christ, and therefore those who stayed behind would endanger their souls and their salvation. But the United States and South Vietnam weren't the only side to use propaganda to sway the flow of migration, even if the CIA techniques employed were more sophisticated and elaborate. For the Viet Minh, their counter-propaganda campaigns aimed at deterring the population from leaving the north. They encouraged rumors that the French and Americans were torturing and killing refugees, while also circulating pamphlets depicting the sailors of Task Force 90 as baby-eating cannibals. They warned those living in the refugee camps that those horrible conditions were indicative of what was waiting for them in the south and predicted disaster for South Vietnam. They also spread rumors that the American sailors intended to throw them overboard to drown them in the ocean, and that they had also poisoned the food and water. Finally, the Viet Minh told the immigrants that running to the south was futile since a communist victory was inevitable, expected as early as 1956. It's hard to measure the effectiveness of all this propaganda for either side, but Lansdale commented on the CIA propaganda's limited success, saying, "People don't just pull up their roots and transplant themselves because of slogans. They honestly feared what might happen to them, and their emotion was strong enough to overcome their attachment to their land, their home, and their ancestral graves." So the initiative was very much theirs, and we mainly made the transportation possible. For the Viet Minh, a much more effective strategy when compared to their counter-propaganda seems to have been the use of military force. According to some estimates, up to 2 million people were discouraged from even attempting to travel south by the presence of Viet Minh troops. Crucially, for what was to unfold over the next 2 decades, Of the almost 1.2 million Catholics that lived in the north, as many as 60% of them moved to the south, part of the approximate million people who moved. The mass influx of refugees presented serious social challenges for the new southern state. Many of the immigrants refused to settle in and develop the inhospitable frontier and failed to integrate into southern society. This resulted in entire villages that had been transplanted from the north, existing in the south, but having no connection or ties to the wider community around them. There was also friction between the Buddhist majority that already lived in the south and the Catholics that had emigrated from the north. These divides were deepened by Diem's policy that heavily favored his fellow Catholics, which he was reliant on for his own power. To reward their loyalty, he granted them the majority of leadership posts in his government and in the army, as well as granting them better business deals and property privileges. A good portion of the South's ruling elites, as a result, had no history with the territory they now governed and were often seen as outsiders by the South Vietnamese. Ultimately, Diem's pro-Catholic stance led to the Buddhist Crisis of 1963, the overthrow of Diem's regime, and his assassination during the November coup. We should also point out that the flight of so much of the Catholic population of the North to the South benefited Ho Chi Minh and the Communists, who no longer had to deal with such a large group of anti-communists as they consolidated their own hold over the North. Operation Passage to Freedom and the overall movement of people from North to South had a profound and ultimately destabilizing effect on the fate of South Vietnam. It served to increase and intensify US interest and involvement in the region and forged new contacts and new opportunities that would be leveraged only a few years later as military operations began to intensify. Escaping the North was seen as a win for the personal liberties and personal freedoms of those fleeing the communist North, but unbeknownst to most of those migrants, some of the key conditions had been set that would result in the ultimate triumph of the North over the South and the reunification of Vietnam. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have launched a leaflet campaign against other bell buttons to indicate that by supporting them, the entire History YouTube community will be immolated in a nuclear apocalypse. The only way to stop this is by making sure to press our bell button. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our patrons and our subscribers, since without your help, none of this would be possible week after week. If you aren't a patron, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, I will leave you with the words of JFK. In the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal.